Sunday morning news, views, and interviews. Your host, as they say, popping in and out with this new stratospheric technology, Aaron Mayer. And my guest today is Dr. Michael Dorsey. Michael Dorsey is a longtime environmental activist, scholar, climate leader. He is the boss, and we're going to talk about boss later on. But we got to talk about this man and his contribution to the environmental movement, the environmental space, from a people of color consciousness all the way around to a planetary global people's consciousness. This brother is truly a universal global citizen, scholar, and intellectual. You will see him on just about every single national or international major news network talking about climate and how we need to act urgently right now, currently in the climate crisis. Brother Dr. Michael Dorsey, I want to welcome you. And I'm just going to call you Brother Michael because you and I go back years, brother. So I'm not going to count, get all the titles, but everybody can see that you got the title right there. So we do you justice and we honor the doctor, as I say, but all those other credentials and milestones. Brother, welcome, welcome, welcome.
Aaron, thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be with you, and thank you for inviting me to the show.
So let's begin with your journey, brother. I call it Call of the Wild, brother. And when we talk about the 80s, in the early 80s, there's not too many people of color in the environmental movement or into what I call the mainstream environmental outings and hiking space. You were one of the earlier brothers that I knew, and I remember when you were just a young chap out there. We go back, as I say, knowing what was in the room with the Toxic Waste and Race, the first People of Color Summit, the second People of Color Summit. But let's talk about that Call of the Wild, that intersectional moment that brought you as a young man, now you're an old man, into the movement.
I had no epiphany. There was no Don King moment. There was no lightning strike. All my life, I've been committed, wedded to thinking about, pondering our role in the universe, in nature, on this planet. I've always been interested in the out of doors. I've always been thinking about really not so much environmentalism or environmental problems per se, but about the way in which people intersect with economic and political systems and the consequences that that intersection has with where we live, where we play, where we sleep, where we worship, and so forth. And that wonder, that quandary, that pondering has put me, I would say, in environmentalism and thinking about ways where we can work on environmental problems and hopefully not just work on those problems, but deliver what we like to think of now, what we're working on here at Arizona State University, sustainability solutions, and really scaling those solutions and bringing them not just to everyone in this country, but really, truly, sincerely to all citizens and all people around the world, no matter where they are, no matter how old or young, how wealthy or poor, how endowed or unendowed they are in terms of resources, you name it. Really working to scale what matters and what's going to get us into the future where we need to be. And that future is absolutely one that's clean, green, lean, and healthy.
One of the things you and I share, he's a good friend of mine, but I think he was one of your mentors and thesis coordinators, Dr. Bunyan Bryant at Michigan University. Tell me a little bit about when you came across Dr. Bryant and his impact on your life.
Absolutely. Bunyan, you're correct. He was my doctoral advisor. He's a good friend. He's a good family friend. I've known him the better part of, coming in over 30 years, really. I think I must have first met him in the late 80s, early 90s. I want to put it at, either 89, 90, 90, 91. And it's interesting the way in which I met him. At the time, I was an undergraduate at the University of Michigan, where he was professor. He's now professor emeritus in what used to be called the School of Natural Resources, now the Sustainability School there at the University of Michigan. And he was, doing his thing as a professor. He started in sociology and moved with a more of an emphasis on environmental sociology. And I was at the time in those late 80s, early 90s, thinking about transitioning out of engineering and looking at other departments and schools across the university.
Hmm.
And so, just like anybody who's thinking of transitioning in their life, you start reaching out to people in that space that you think you might be destined to.
Right, right, right.
So I reached out to folks in geology and in other areas, anthropology, and also in natural resources. I had lots of friends pointing me that way, in
Hmm.
part because I'd been involved in student activism on campus at the University of Michigan, and even before then, in high school, and environmental concerns. So my first meeting, other than those exchanges of emails with Bunyan, was actually he took me for lunch at the Michigan League, which was actually the first union for women at the University of Michigan, still around the league. And we had, I think we might have been scheduled for your typical lunch an hour or so. Uh, Maybe 2 or 3 hours later, in a really long and probing conversation, he more or less was the individual that convinced me to well, he convinced me that transitioning out of engineering wasn't going to imperil my life, like some folks in the engineering school had been hinting at. Because why would a successful young black person who's doing okay in math and science want to leave engineering, where he or
Right.
she was destined to make money, to go and do something as foolish as go and join folks in a school of natural resources? That was the narrative that folks
Well,
in
isn't that always the push, right? You guys, if you're going to college, you got to become part of the corporate industrial complex to get a good job, get a good education, get a good job, but not really reflecting upon what that job means to one's health, wealth, and status, but also to the planet. Do you care? Are you there only for the cash, or are you there to develop also a conscious? And as you know, what happens in college, we develop consciousness and awareness. That's where you have that second awakening. So all that's going on in your head. So I mean, it's not just you're going to get an engineering degree and work for the corporations. There's a broader conversation. No.
Absolutely, for sure. And that conversation was one I was already having, personally. But I think, Bunyan was an individual and still is, he's a good friend to this day.
Hmm.
Though he's, emeritus and retired from the University of Michigan. He was one that really didn't really make the argument, but elaborated really wonderfully the case for working on environmental justice, the case for thinking about the intersection of justice and the environment, and how something could be done about it. Few people
Right.
know, unless you really know Bunyan, he had already, at that time when I sat with him, as a very young undergraduate, he had already had a track record in politics and still is active politically. He'd run for mayor of Ann Arbor. He didn't,
Okay.
he didn't win, but he had been for many years at that point in the late 80s, early 90s, thinking about, and not just thinking, but really applying himself and putting himself forward to deliver solutions,
Hmm.
justice-based solutions for his community, for the state of Michigan, really for the whole country and the world.
Hmm. Hmm. And I met Bunyan. Oh my God, shortly after we were having those initial conversations, post toxic waste and race. At that time, at 87, 88, I was basically wrapped up trying to shut down a solid waste and a raw solid waste incinerator that was poisoning my family. And he was one of the few scholars when we were trying to build the case and build the academic argument. His name came up, early on. Charles Lee did that analysis, him, Bernice Miller Chavez, and Ben Chavis. But from that came the issue of, the communities now starting to see having a study, an academic study, backing up the experience. And then sociologists and scholars like Bunyan Bryan saying, it's movement building time. And he was one of the really people that really pushed. When we talk about an EJ movement, everybody likes to say, oh, it started down in North Carolina. I go, listen, I'm up in Albany, New York, fighting in solid waste and incinerator. And if you read Toxic Waste and Race Study, it doesn't have it began here in North Carolina. It was basically documenting this phenomena all across the nation.
Absolutely. I mean, you really have a, a quilt of movements, some very, very local,
Well, they were
some
incidents. I call them incidents. The dots were really not a movement until people like Bunyan and others post the Toxic Waste and Race, post the People of Color Summit. But the point is, there was a scattering, the shotgun effect of incidents, and the toxic waste and race study really pulled together that there's something bigger going on and made us all aware.
I think toxic waste and race absolutely did that, but I'm going to push back and challenge you that there was a network of movements. They weren't as perhaps as robust as we might think of them or imagine them now.
Well, I
But
want you to hold that
we're
thought.
working together.
I want you to hold that thought. We got to get a commercial in here, and we're going to pick it up right there.
Sure.
Sunday morning news, views, and interviews. Your host, Aaron Mayer, and we are absolutely digging a little bit of, as I say, climate, and not only that, but environmental justice history. Here with us, Dr. Michael Dorsey. He is the boss, but he's also a longtime movement leader, activist, thought leader, international world-renowned scholar, and the go-to pundit that media goes to when it talks about climate, race, and place. But also right now, in the wake of this, of all this national economic investment right now, he is also scaling up and also pushing people of color and communities of color into the entrepreneurial side of climate and climate action. Before we went to a break, Michael was talking about and pushing back against my notion about the incidents and that we weren't connected. Michael's lifting up and say, well, a little known fact is actually there were some groups and some people that were actually pulling together. So, Mike, why don't you tease that out a little bit?
Well, look, since we were talking about my buddy and doctoral advisor, Dr. Bunyan Bryant, I'll first just give a hat tip to his new memoir, just came out just almost a year ago this month, called Educator and Activist, My Life and Times in the Quest for Environmental Justice. That's by Bunyan Bryant Jr., Dr. Bunyan Bryant Jr. And that book is certainly not just a personal memoir, his autobiography, as it were, but it is a wonderful story of the growth of what we now recognize as the not just U.S., but the global movement for environmental justice that has put communities from Mississippi to Maine and connected them down to Mozambique and over around to Myanmar and back around through Micronesia and over to the coast of Alaska and then down to the Americas, all through South America, and really truly a global network. But that network is not as robust. I'll say it like this: that network is as robust as it is today because of the sort of the foundational seeds that were being sowed, really generation, even more ago, by local movements in communities, some of whom working across the states or between states or within the states that they were, some of whom particularly, up in your neck of the woods there in New York, where many of your listeners are, working across the border with, brothers and sisters in Canada, tackling the issues of transboundary pollution, the factories in New England and the Northeast of the U.S. having huge deleterious impacts on forest communities in, Ontario and Quebec, and also lakes and so forth with acid rain and so forth. So we really see, that movement beginning, generation or two ago, and then leveraging, technologies and so forth from the internet and on and on and on to how we kind of know them and know those movements at this moment in time.
So in 1991, this was, just about when you and I start to cross paths and come together and meet up. You were a youth delegate to the first U.S. National People of Color Summit. Your thoughts, your reflections, but more important, tell us your journey, how you ended up there. I love the story because you knocked on a number of doors, brother, and you were not going to be turned away. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your journey?
It was an interesting one. I had first heard that folks from the United Church of Christ were organizing the summit, which was held in October of 1991 in Washington, D.C., put together by folks like Charles Lee, who has been running the Environmental Protection Agency's Office on Environmental Justice, other folks like Reverend Ben Chavis.
And Charles Lee is the author, along with Ben, who was the person who called for the toxic waste and race study, the first ever systematic analysis of linking race, pollution, and inequality, and coming up with the fact that race was the factor and the determining factor wherever negative amenities or polluting facilities would be cited. So your race determined if you got the polluting facility. Go on.
Absolutely. So I had heard that this effort was underway probably, as early as the summer of 91. And I was quite keen on, trying to participate and so forth. And at the same time, there was a coincident activity going on because the world was on course to hosting in Brazil 1 year later the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, or the Earth Summit,
Mm-hmm.
the sort of big summit to
We'll get that. I got that in the pocket. I got that in my hip pocket. I want to talk about the journey, brother. I want to talk about the trip, brother. I want to talk about the throwdown.
Well, my role was pretty easy. I mean, it was really making a request to be at the summit, and I was, I think, fortunate enough of being a student of Bunyan's and working on these issues and working with him to get that invite, and really to be extended a delegate role there where delegates had voice and vote to work on and co-draft what ultimately became the principles of environmental justice, 17 principles of
Mm-hmm.
environmental justice that the participants there, particularly the delegates, we discussed and debated and argued about, and ultimately delineated and adopted on the final day of the summit, back in 1991.
Mm-hmm.
I think the challenge or the struggle that you're referring to was really the way in which the summit was composed. There were three tiers of participants. There were
Exactly.
delegates,
Exactly.
like myself, who had voice and vote and could participate, very openly and actively in the process, and also ultimately voted on what then became those 17 principles of environmental justice. We
Mm-hmm.
had two other tiers. We had folks that had voice but no vote, and then we had folks that had no vote and no voice. And
I
you
was
could,
I was in the latter because, as they say, I was one of those folks that you came to the party late. It's supposed to be about you. I'm looking at who's speaking. I'm saying, well, wait a minute. The frontline community. In fact, the report came out of New York City. How does the guy suing in New York State, who's in court in federal court in New York State, not wait what? And that's when you learn about how this thing was put together. Speak to that layer cake.
well, I would say that approach of having those three tiers of engagement in the process was to both empower and respect those that have been doing that work for many, many years before then. And then also to, dare I say, put people somewhat in their place, but nevertheless include them. You had many white leaders of environmental organizations that were invited to the process,
Mm-hmm.
some whose participation was certainly questioned, but they were extended an invite, but they were put in a place of no vote, no voice,
Mm-hmm.
in part because the conference, the summit, was really about centering marginalized voices and which is distinct from excluding voices in the majority. Let me be clear. The centering of the marginalized has nothing to do with necessarily excluding those that have been, in the dominant group. So
Mm-hmm.
those that have used to or were used to controlling affairs, deciding things, got the invite extended to them, but in a capacity which they had no voice, no vote. And that's a nod to the fact that those, you know, newly setting the agenda, those from the margins, they need to have those relationships and those exchanges, but folks need to be, let us say, put in their place. And I think the summit did a wonderful, um, nicely did that, nicely architected that process. And
Mm-hmm.
you had, really people from quite literally all over the world. Just slightly more than 1,000 people came to the summit,
Mm-hmm.
from all 50 states, but as well as from Puerto Rico, as far away as Chile, Mexico, Marshall Islands, and really a nod to the true, call it proto-global nature of the environmental justice movement. You wouldn't be able to get 1,000 plus people at a environmental justice summit if you hadn't already had legacies of activism and so forth. And that legacy is a testament to some of those folks that were there in 1991 whom we've lost. folks like our mutual friend Damu Smith, who used to be
Absolutely.
an activist at Greenpeace, and
Sister
a
Connie
long
Tucker. Sister Connie Tucker.
Connie Tucker, indeed, folks like Dana Austin, folks like
Mhm.
Gene Garner, the late Hazel Johnson, who is an amazing activist on the south side of Chicago, whose legacy is being carried on by her
Sure.
daughter and other family members in that region. A long list of amazing characters, folks like the late Dr. Gene Sindab, an amazing pioneer who initially started, working for racial justice in this country, but then became a real outspoken advocate, in the anti-apartheid movement, and a
Hmm.
long, long list of other individuals, and many of whom are, others whom are still around now and have been, doing pioneering work over, more than 3 decades. Some,
I think
4 or 5 decades.
Brother Moore is still over in New Mexico. No.
Absolutely. Richard Moore, again, another amazing activist who was there, led the co-founding of the Southwest Network for Economic and Environmental Justice and the Southwest Organizing Project, and is still doing amazing work, not just in New Mexico, where he's from, but in the whole, Southwest New Mexico, and then also in the Northwest, not the Northwest of the United States, but the Northwest of Mexico.
There you go. But
So
hold that thought.
true.
Hold that thought. We got to get another commercial, and time's flying when we're having fun. Again, your host, Aaron Mayer, news, views, and interviews with our guest, Dr. Michael Dorsey. We'll be right back. Sunday morning news, views, and interviews. Your host, Aaron Mayer, our wonderful guest today. Again, bringing the fire and bringing the knowledge and bringing the noise, but also the history of the movement and the journey. And he is, as they say, not only giving us that old history of the environmental justice movement, but more importantly, his journey into the movement, when as he would become on this, as I say, go like many people, blow up in the movement. Back then you were a minister without portfolio, brother, and now you have file cabinets. Brother Dr. Michael Dorsey, brother, again, welcome this morning. We were talking about the People of Color Summit, the 3 tiers, but also how it was essential because this was the place and space where a lot of people, a lot of movement, a lot of actions finally came together. We had the study. Now we have, everybody now synchronizing and putting flesh onto data points. And that was the thing to me that struck me about the toxic waste. I mean, the first People of Color Summit. You're finally putting stories. And this is where I think it's really hard, where you try to say this is the indexing story when a movement is made out of many battles and many, many fronts. Because like I said, and if you were to ask me in 1988, right when we were doing sampling and doing community-based sampling, again, I thought as a public health professional, applying my skills as a public health professional researcher doing community-based sampling, I thought I was doing innovative work. It wasn't until 1991 that I realized other people were doing the similar things. And so this is where it gets really tough because there are a lot of other public health professionals or people with networks, but connecting with universities, connecting with other organizations, people were going out and getting, Sister Hazel Johnson, Chicago, as we mentioned. People were going out doing the door-to-door rudimentary grassroots citizen science. In fact, in my opinion, the field of health disparities and health disparity analysis comes out of the environmental justice movement, because this is where you start to look at not only negative health outcomes, but start to connecting those negative health outcomes to the built environment in which people live. And it wasn't until the toxic waste and race study builds that dimension, and we start to look at the asthma, et cetera, and all these other comorbidities that go along with pollution and pollution risk and pollution exposure.
You're absolutely right. I mean, you had at the time, and you still have it to this day. We got to emphasize this: an amazing amount of, let's call it street science, as my good friend Dr. Jason Corburn over at UC Berkeley calls it in his older book called Street Science, Community Knowledge, and Environmental Health Justice. We've got a tremendous amount of innovative science, not lay person data collecting, true science that's happening in the streets, not in those suites, not paid for by corporations and corporate hacks to get particular outcomes that
or
you
universities with the grants, right? Because one of the things that happened,
absolutely not, neither of that. You got folks that are collecting data in their communities to understand the extent of the injustices that they're facing.
but one of the things I saw in the phenomenon you could definitely speak to was I saw universities parachuting in because one of the forms of environmental racism was I call the technical assistance angle. So universities would come in and all of a sudden they're like, oh, they're collecting data. Oh, there's a whole research population, what I call lazy scholars coming in, sweeping in and taking that grassroots knowledge, publishing a paper under their name, but not crediting the EJ communities that did the foundational work. And there was a hell of a pushback and call for accountability of universities because we called it capacity building. We're sick and tired of people from universities coming in, getting a grant, getting a $50,000 grant, get some heavy duty equipment, but then take it to their college or take it to their own consultancy and not leave that capacity within the community. So one of the big battles was stewardship and ownership of the data. We were being poisoned. We knew what we were doing. We knew about the data collection, but there was that battle for the right of people of color to control the damn data.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, in America, the American body politic has an allergy to the even thought of racism. There's a deep inability to articulate racist tendencies, systemic racism in this country, particularly by those that aren't black and brown and poor and otherwise. But really, there's a deep lack of a coherent conversation about the extent of systemic racism. We see occasionally breakthroughs where people are motivated by catastrophic, events like the extrajudicial murder of Mr. Floyd, just a couple of years ago, and a big sort of push and more of it, unfortunately, sort of showcasing and showy pushing to rethink things and open up things like diversity, equity, and inclusion. But really, that showiness is deeply rooted in the American body politics allergy to even thinking about racism, let alone speaking it, let alone owning it. And that allergy that's endemic in this society in the United States is one that compels researchers to outright deny those that offer up claims to racism, outright deny those that don't just offer the claims, but actually come with the data, the empirical data. It's a disease, really, unfortunately, that in the long run, and certainly even in the short and medium run, it undermines us socially, economically, a lot of data on that. And so some of the antithetical reaction to the research about the persistence and prevalence of environmental racism, the disproportionate siting and locating of toxic facilities in Black and brown communities and neighborhoods is I would say, that allergic reaction deeply in that, particularly that white American body politic that compels people to just deny outright anybody who offers up the term racism. Well, it can't be because, well, I'm not racist. It's kind of the unfortunate refrain in this country. You don't see that in a lot of other places.
And that gets me to the point, because this is where you begin your real leap with regards to United Nations climate leadership. But, going all the way back, your first, bite on the international level was with the United States Department delegation to the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro. Tell a little bit about your international journey and taking the message globally.
Well, I've always been committed and concerned about things not just happening in my backyard, as it were, but really truly how that backyard has implications on those down the road, down the street, down the lane, in the county, in the state, but also across the border in other countries, and really truly around the world. And not just how those problems have global implications, but really truly how we can learn from, work with, other scholars, researchers, activists, advocates, businesses to solve those problems. We can't be in a situation where we understand and accept that there are certain global problems out there, whether they be threats to biodiversity, whether they be the climate catastrophe unfolding before our very eyes, and not truly understand and accept the global nature of those problems, and then say, well, we're only going to work with a few Americans and a handful of wealthy white Americans, or a particular kind of American, or a particular kind of individual. If we've got global problems, we got to work with folks around the world. We got to work with folks in different countries. I've always been oriented that way. I will no doubt be oriented that way until they lay me low. And that understanding, that disposition, compelled me to be simultaneously interested in getting at and being a delegate at the First National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit, but also trying to take that message and work about environmental justice into the space of the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development. And because
Mm-hmm.
that process that I was in, it was actually a two-track process. I left the meeting in October of 1991 at the First National People of Color Leadership Summit on that long weekend in DC, and went right up to New York to the United Nations at the preparatory meetings for the Earth Summit, and was actively involved in taking the messages that came out of the Environmental Justice Summit, that was in DC, and opening and pushing that conversation with folks that were already working on very similar problems, toxic waste in their own communities, the disproportionate siting of waste that we see from French nuclear waste that's being dumped in North Africa, to similar problems in Australia, where Australians are dumping waste and doing nuclear tests on Aboriginal lands, and many other forms of environmental racism and discrimination that we see
Exactly. Well, the thing is
around
that
the world.
they weren't connecting the dots, and all of a sudden we have this national epiphany coming out of the toxic waste and race study, coming up to a national conference and conversation on, as I say, First People of Color Summit, but building a movement, but realizing that not only Black communities, brown communities are dumped on the United States, we were dumping on Black and brown countries around the globe. So it took on a higher level. And and then looking at how international laws and relationships and aid were tied to making these countries toxic dumping grounds. Listen, we're going to get ready for the last segment. We got to get this last commercial in, and we'll pick it up at the top of the half. Sunday morning, news, views, and interviews. Boy, time flies when we're having fun, and we're just only scratching the surface. So I'm going to definitely have an extension out there that, we're going to have you come back, brother, because I know that you and I will probably both be at the COP28 summit, by the way, in the Arab Emirates. And so, we will be there. So we'll probably do a post-COP show, or we'll probably do a show at COP.
Sure, it'll be my pleasure. Love to do it.
But we were just talking about your work and your leadership at the UN, and taking that leadership to the climate leadership at the UN, and then bringing that analysis that we have domestically within the United States, and realizing the phenomenon is a global racism phenomenon. And it actually turned on the eyes, and actually it empowered a broader conversation, because that conversation was not being had at the State Department, at the Council of Foreign Relations. The issue of race and garbage, international garbage dumping, international waste disposal, and these are real serious crises to this day, because we talk about microplastics, how plastics are being dumped in Southeast Asian nations and then dumped into the Pacific Ocean, creating the massive, as they say, plastic gyre out there in the middle of the Pacific. But again, frontline communities choking on the trash of first world nations, but the technology to actually address that coming from oppressed communities within the United States of America. Again, your leadership in this space, brother.
Well, absolutely. I mean, back in those days, in the late 80s and even early 90s, we didn't even have what we now sort of take as established fact, a little known treaty that maybe none of your listeners have ever heard of, called the Basel Convention. The full title of that treaty is really, I think, compelling and noteworthy: the Basel Convention on the Control of Transboundary Movements of Hazardous Waste and Their Disposal. The shorthand, we call it the Basel Treaty. And that really was an effort to tackle that problem, the way in which the North, the rich countries of the world, literally dump on the poorer countries of the
Real quick
world.
point, so we're educating our listeners. Who's in UN speak, we talk about the global North and the global South. The global North are basically the rich capitalist nations. The global South, again, divided by the equator, Africa, Latin America, Asia, those nations, the third world nations. And so, a lot of the fights that we take for granted today, like the climate fight, it was actually 2002, I believe in Bali, it was the global South and national leaders like Tom Goldtooth of the Indigenous Environmental Network were the first out there sounding the alarms on climate change. But continue, brother.
Well, so the world, as we know, unfortunately, for better or for worse, is essentially akin to one big underdeveloped nation, where the supermajority, the super rich, are in the absolute minority, and the vast majority of folks are poor and on the margins. That's true on the planet overall. That's true in the context of wealthy nations. They make up a very small percentage of the total world's population, but the fact is that those that are the wealthiest and the most powerful, they're contributing the most to a lot of our planetary problems. To be rich and wealthy means not only do you have a car, but sometimes it means you may have several cars and several homes. Your
No, no,
regular home
you
or
get to dispose of your car every 3 to 5 years. So the
absolutely,
waste footprint, of a nation that throws away cars, and I compare it to Cuba. They're still driving around 40 from 1945 to 1958 Chevys. Okay, and so the cars, and as I say, can last, but the first world, with regards to its disposal economy, which is part of the core of the capitalism, keep you jonesing, keep you buying, keep you polluting, keep you wasting. So the first world, the global north, not only concentration of wealth, but it's also the concentration and disproportionate producer of toxic waste, hazardous waste, the whole waste sector. There's nothing more wasteful than the global north.
absolutely. I mean, to be rich is to be a polluter, essentially bar none, and to be poor is to be sort of in a double bind, and really multiple binds. One, to be poor is to be the recipient of the world's waste. To be the recipient of being on disproportionate end of toxic waste and race. That's what we found when we began looking at the issues of environmental racism. But it also means that being poor and being on the margins means that you're contributing the least to the problem.
Mm-hmm.
When you're poor, you don't just not have a car. You may not even be able to access public transport, because sometimes being poor means that public transport is even out of your reach. So your overall contribution of waste and emissions and so forth is very, very low. Unfortunately, and so we're living in a world where those that are rich and powerful are quite literally dumping on those that are poor and marginalized. And really, the effort of delivering environmental justice, delivering energy justice, is about rectifying that very undermining, contradictory world in which we live at the present moment.
And this is one of the things that I want to really steer into Boss real quickly, because not only are we talking about the problems in your journey into learning how to fight the problems and connecting the dots, not only nationally but globally, but now that they're investing in this space, one of the things that you said, don't be dependent, be independent. So why don't you talk about being the boss, brother?
Well, thank you for mentioning that. This is one of the newer initiatives that me and some colleagues have launched, just a couple years old, something called Black Owners of Solar Services. I would encourage all your listeners to check us out online. The website is blacksolar.org, blacksolar.org. Check us out. The mission of BOSS really is fairly straightforward. It's to combine and leverage the collective power of our members, which are developers, installers of renewable energy, particularly solar, hence the name Black Owners of Solar Services. We're trying to combine and leverage our collective power to lead really the sustainability solutions, where we can deliver equitable opportunities for folks in the clean energy production space, as well as distribution and storage for those very same Black-owned businesses, but also for communities in which they live, and for communities that are been on the margins and been excluded from energy production and generation. So we think by centering those on the margins, centering Black owners, Black businesses, Black installers, developers of sustainability, services, as it were, not just solar, but wind, solar, geothermal, and so forth, the whole suite of renewable technologies on the generation side, but also storage and even energy efficiency work. We can really move the needle and deliver not just clean green energy for those on the margins, but really play a key pivotal role in delivering that sustainability solution set for everybody on Earth.
But it's about energy as I say, energy, independence too. I mean, it's tapping into this tech, because most people of color feel that that's big high tech. We don't know anything about it, so we're just going to be a consumer. This is a time which really calls for innovation. And right now, billions with a B coming from the Inflation Reduction Act out of Washington, D.C., is right now seeding an entirely new green economy. But our people right now, the uptake because of fear, because we've been always locked out. So now all of a sudden water is flowing and we don't even know how to make a cup to get a sip.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, Boss is at the forefront of installing solar generation, at the forefront of moving our business owners into more opportunities in terms of transacting projects, in terms of installing not just kilowatts, not just megawatts, but really gigawatts and terawatts. That is our, event horizon. That is our destination. And we know we need that because it's going to be clean energy, renewable wind, and solar that's going to get us out of the climate catastrophe that's unfolding and playing out before our very eyes. And we've got a whole universe of Black-owned solar companies and businesses that have been working on the full sort of commodity chain of solar energy, but also renewable energy broadly, from Maine to Miami and Miami to Seattle and Sacramento, all the way over to St. Louis and all points in between and beyond.
What does the national commitment look like in national support? We always know national props up banks, props up the oil sector, props up the oil industry, gives them the incentive. What is national? What is the White House? What is Congress doing for Boss?
Well, that's really, I'm glad you flagged that. We are a fortunate recipient of a new cooperative agreement from the Department of Energy,
Wow.
particularly working in cooperation with their Office of Economic Impact, Diversity and Economic Impact, which is an office that's headed by Senate confirmed and appointed Director Shalonda Baker. She's there with a mandate really to, I would say, no less than rethink the way in which the Department of Energy has served communities, Black, white, brown, otherwise, in this country. Most people don't really realize that the Department of Energy's, the bulk of its budget has been, it's a nuclear agency. It could be just called the Department of Nuclear Energy. More than 50% of its budget is allocated to deal with, nuclear energy, nuclear weapons and waste and so forth. So on some level, one could argue that the DOE has been driving, the energy injustice problem in this country, because we know that in terms of waste, particularly in terms of the siting of nuclear facilities and so forth, the waste is dumped in marginalized communities. The nuclear testing has been done on native land and poor white Americans in Utah and the downwinders, as we know.
Oh,
So
let me make sure we get that boss.org sign back up, so we'll take that to the out. Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you for putting that up. Please, I encourage your listeners to tune into that. So really, we're in a process now with the current administration of rethinking the way in which the Department of Energy serves and facilitates the deployment, not just of energy in general, certainly not fossil fuels and nuclear, but really renewable energy, and how it does that, I think, to serve and benefit those on the margins.
And
Black
on that point,
communities.
my brother, I want to thank you for taking time out of your busy day to enlighten our listeners. This will be posted upon the YouTube, and so it will be evergreen and be ever there. But getting this knowledge, getting it recorded, but also getting your voice, your skill, and your journey, brother, out there for the history for our listeners and for the youth that want to study the movement. This is what it's all about. News, views, and interviews. Again, we want to thank our guest, Dr. Michael Dorsey.